That's recorded.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Chichester. And if this is your first visit, then you're particularly welcome, and I hope we'll see you again. My name is Sarah Gilroy. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University, and it's my pleasure to be here tonight to introduce Bill to you. I'm sure most of you are aware of Bill's work, but I would just like to say a few words before I invite Bill to draw us into his world of folklore, fantasy and fairy tales. What I'd like to do is just set Bill's work in a wider university context. And that context really is about research and teaching at the university. A few weeks ago, there was a good university guide published for 2016 by the Times, and it's one of these guides that comments on a number of aspects about universities, trying to help applicants make important decision making. We were really very pleased to find that in that publication, the Times identified the University of Chichester as being 12th out of the 127 universities in the country for teaching quality. And for one of the country's smaller universities, that really is quite an achievement. And for us, it was really an affirmation of what we do and how we teach and how we research. Because for us, at this university, we think we do something quite special, and that is that all our teachers research and all our researchers teach. So we have the likes of Bill, who inspires undergraduates, postgraduates alike, and the general public with all of his public engagement work about folklore, fantasy and fairy tales. But Bill obviously has quite an international profile, as many of you will be aware. And I really did just want to see something about that, but not so much to read through a list of all Bill's accomplishments, some of which you'll see summarised in the brochure for tonight. And had I had more time, I maybe would have engaged you in a bit of audience participation and asked you what links the following things: Universal Pictures, Elle magazine, the National Theatre, the Royal Opera House, the Daily Mirror, and many other publications and august bodies. The answer is in front of us. It's Bill. They've sought out Bill.
Not Piers Morgan.
Not yet. For his understanding, expertise, and advice. So I'm particularly delighted that Bill, managed to give us the time tonight to share with us, why we need fairy tales. Because Bill is too bashful, as you will probably know, he's not going to say some of this himself, so I will say it for him. Bill, as you maybe know, is written biographies about C.S. Lewis, about Robert Louis Stevenson. He's published and contributed to numerous edited collections around a whole variety of writers. And to have Bill joining us tonight is just a super kind of pleasure. But of course, Bill doesn't just write and tuck himself away. Bill's so passionate about folklore and fairy tale that back in 2009-10, Bill founded the Sussex Centre for Folklore and Fairy Tales. It is thriving, it is going really well, and also finds time to edit Grammary. And I was just catching up with Bill to find out how progress. Oh yes, a little bit of promotion over there. I was just finding out how Bill was getting on with editing Robert Louis Stevenson's fairy tales and fables, because it's something that Bill and I have often spoken about as fellow Scots about RLS and how the latest work is going. And what I'm so thrilled to hear about is that, of course, this edition that Bill's working on, that hopes to be completed published by end of next year, Edinburgh Press willing, Edinburgh University Press willing, is that it will be the first edition and probably the true edition.
The definitive
edition since 1896. And even then, Bill tells me, that edition really wasn't following what RLS had asked for and the instructions he'd left. So we have with us somebody who will inspire, excite, and probably throw a few questions our way tonight about why we need fairy tales. So just to say, what we're planning is that Bill will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end, should anybody wish to ask them. And just so you don't have to project your voices too far, David here will jump up with the microphone, and so everybody can hear the question you would like to ask Bill. So we're thinking we'll probably, be going, wrapping up round about 7ish, but nobody's going to throw us out if the debate is still going and it's lively. So, Bill, thank you very much, and because I can't use Bill's proper title, Professor William Gray, it's not, it's Bill. So we were chatting earlier, and Bill wondered if I was the warm-up act, so that you get a bit of Scottish brogue, not too broad. Bill's is a wee bit stronger still. So think of me as the warm-up act, so get your ears attuned. And now I'll hand over to the real act for tonight, Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, I'm going to fiddle around with this because I didn't want to interrupt your warm-up act. Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, you're too kind. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Can people hear me? Sorry about this, folks. Is that better? Can you hear? Good. Thank you. Because, as Sarah said, I do have a rather soft Glaswegian accent, so it may take you a minute or two to just tune in. So here we go. I thought I would begin, in fact, by giving a little programme for what I hope to talk about, what I'm planning to talk about this evening, just to keep me on track, because it really was hard work cutting down what I want to say about fairy tales, why we need fairy tales, to 40 minutes. That was really hard. So I've done it in batches, and this will keep me on track. It might allow you to see how close we are to the end. So first of all, I want to talk about what are fairy tales, then to look at fairy tale histories. There's been a great deal of controversy about the history of fairy tales. Then a section of why we don't need fairy tales, then a section of why we do need fairy tales. And then a section which is a bit puzzling, why fairy tales need us. And finish off with fairy tales and myth. So I'll get cracking and hope to get through this as speedily as possible. If you miss something, or if you can't hear me, or if I'm going too fast, please let me know, because I don't want you to miss any of the points I make, because I think some of this stuff is really important. First of all, what are fairy tales? The fairy tale is notoriously difficult to define, and there is no generally accepted definition. The English term seems to derive from the French term conte des fées, first used in French by Madame d'Aulnoy's real name is Marie-Catherine La Jumelle de Barneville, Baroness d'Aulnoy, also known as Madame d'Aulnoy, who's Les Contes des Fées, published in 1697. You see, she doesn't include her own name, presumably. Everyone looks guilty. It's not me, it's not me. I promise you it's not me. No, I'm dead. I'm dead. Where are we? Come on. But I may as well kill it, for sure. Oh, die bugger. Okay. This is the first use of the word conte de fées by Madame d'Aulnoy in 1697. It was probably the same year as Perrault's famous, what we call fairy tales, but actually he called them tales or stories of past times. Histoire ou conte du temps passé, or more famously known as the Contes de ma mère Loi, the Mother Goose Tales. It seems that the first time the term fairy tale was used in English was in Sarah Fielding's children's novel of 1749 called The Governess. Now, the term underlying the Grimm's so-called fairy tales is Märchen, or little story, literally in German. The title in German is Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales, first published in 1812, with the final, much revised edition in 1857. Scholars generally agree that fairy tales don't necessarily have to contain fairies. Tolkien claimed in his classic essay on fairy stories, there are two books that I get any student who comes my way who wants to write or think or study fairy stories, I say should read two books. First of all, Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, and secondly, George MacDonald's The Fantastic Imagination. I mean, read lots of fairy stories and fantasy, but read at least these two books about fairy tales and fantasy. They're the best theory still that there is. So in his book on fairy stories, Tolkien says that, of course, fairy, the word fairy in fairy tale isn't a kind of elfin being. Fairy is a place, as he calls it, the perilous realm. And in his essay I just mentioned, Fantastic Imagination by George MacDonald, MacDonald writes, when I begged to describe the fairy tale or define what it is, I would answer that I should as soon think of describing the abstract human face or stating what must go to constitute a human being. A fairy tale is just a fairy tale, as a face is just a face. And of all fairy tales I know, I think Undine is the most beautiful. Now notice that MacDonald chooses a literary fairy tale as his example. The relation of oral fairy tales to written fairy tales is much contested. The legend that the Grimm brothers wandered around among the German peasants just writing down their oral folk tales is long discredited. The Grimms themselves encouraged this legend, and it lasted down through the 19th century and until surprisingly recently. Now here is a painting by Ludwig Katzenstein of 1892 of a visit being paid by the Grimm brothers here to Dorothea Freeman, the so-called Märchenfrau. That is the fairy tale wife, I suppose, like the fishwife. Now, this picture is a fabrication. It's a confection. It certainly never happened, and is in fact based on two other paintings. First of all, this one, a famous painting of the Grimm brothers from 1855, and you can see actually, if you look, if I just skip back for a minute, you can see, so I'm going backwards, you can see how closely these two here actually resemble the two there. They're more clearly derived from it. And secondly, this one here, it says at the bottom here, Märchenfrau, Dorothea Freeman. This is from the frontispiece of the second edition of Kinder- und Hausmärchen in 1819. Now notice that Dorothea Freeman died in 1815. So this picture, painted in 1892, is a complete fabrication. For one thing, it seems that Frau Freeman was never visited by the Grimms. The visiting was done by Frau Freeman. She came to them with her stories, and some remuneration for her stories. And some of the so-called fairy tales that the Grimms wrote down were actually sent to them from people who certainly weren't peasants, but in fact were French-speaking middle-class storytellers. Now we know this because some of these supposedly German oral fairy tales were actually versions of French literary fairy tales that in some cases have become oral fairy tales. Don't forget that there's a transaction all the time between oral and literary, and what would happen is people would get the stories from a literary source and then tell the stories with subtle changes as they did it. So these originally literary tales would become part of the oral tradition and then were collected again by the Grimms and turned back into literary form. So there's a backwards and forwards movement in the tradition, which set up the problem, if you like, of my second topic, which is fairy tale histories. The whole question of the relation between the oral and the literary versions of fairy tales is a very complex and very heated issue. One scholar who is very sure of what fairy tales are and what they aren't, and how the literary fairy tale is related to the oral tradition, is Ruth Bottighammer. This controversial 2009 book, Fairy Tales: A New History, pulled together ideas that she'd been presenting for some years and which had caused heated debate in folklore and fairy tale circles. The nub of the matter was Bottighammer's claim that the supposed oral roots of fairy tales, of that she said, literary analysis undermines it, literary history rejects it, social history repudiates it, and publishing history contradicts it. So there's not a lot going for oral tradition for Bottighammer. On the contrary, Bottighammer asserts, and this is her main case, the genre that we recognise as the fairy tale, for her, that means what she calls the rise tale or the rags to riches via magic story, was actually invented by Gianfrancesco Straparola in Venice and first published in the 1550s in his book Le Piacevoli Notti, Pleasant Nights. Now this book was printed. So what she's saying is that the origins of the fairy tale, what we call the fairy tale, have a printed source. And of course, this just caused a furore, because such an attack on the oral roots of fairy tales caused a huge reaction, not least by the godfather of fairy tale studies, Jack Zipes, whom I will mention quite often in this talk. Zipes devoted an appendix of his book, The Irresistible Fairy Tale, published in 2012, his magnum opus probably, to demolishing the arguments of Bottighammer. Zipes attacks from many angles, but his main criticism is that Bottighammer's narrow definition of the fairy tale and her privileging of print culture is elitist and excludes the majority of human beings for most of history. For Zipes, fairy tales belong to the people. Now, Bottighammer and Jack Zipes twice have given talks here at the Sussex Centre and the University of Chichester. However, in their public presentations, they steered clear of this debate about oral versus the printed origins of fairy tales, perhaps because too much blood and certainly much ink had already been spilled. This was a big, big issue in the field. But having said that, in an obvious kind of way, there's an ongoing dialogue or interchange or transaction between oral and literary fairy tales. Tales get told orally and then written down, and then get told again and written down again, and so on. The cycle of tellings and retellings is complicated by the staged presentations that fairy tales have long been a staple of, pantomime as well as opera, and in modern times in films and TV series. So the definitive version of a fairy tale is a most elusive entity. Fairy tales just exist in different forms or different historical embodiments. Now, even the name fairy tale is elusive. The main collections of what we call fairy tales in English are not called that in the original languages. The first writer who did so is, as we've seen, Madame d'Aulnoy in her Les Contes des Fées. However, the relation of these French tales, written at the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th century, to any kind of oral tradition is disputed. Any connection they may have had with oral tradition that is to the nurse or the nanny or Mother Goose, is buried beneath the surface polish of these tales, which were written for a sophisticated literary audience. These are above all literary fairy tales. Now the clarity of Perrault's style has meant that he provided the most familiar version of many of our most famous tales. You look at Disney, you find almost always the version that you get comes from Perrault rather than Grimm. And some of Perrault's tales actually found their way into Grimm's first edition of Kinder- Hausmärchen, or fairy tales, in 1812, though they were later dropped for being too French. A bit here I've missed out because of lack of time is you must understand that the Grimm's Kinder- Hausmärchen were first written in Germany when it was under Napoleonic, that is French occupation. What they were doing is constructing a book of tales from the people, or from the German people, and for the German people. So that idea of nationalism has never sort of gone away from all the projects of folklore collections in the 19th century and until now. Now, if the Italians, I've sort of done this in full because I'm mentioning a few names here, if the Italians, that is Straparola in the 1550s, and Giambattista Pasili, who wrote The Tale of Tales, or Il Pentamarone, in 1634, if these wrote the first European literary fairy tales, followed by the French in the 1690s, the mid-1700s, that's Madame d'Aulnoy who come across, Perrault, Madame de Villeneuve, Madame du Prince de Beaumont, those are famous for their versions of the Beauty and Beast tale. It was the German romantic tradition which took the literary fairy tale in a new direction and even coined a new word for it, the Kunstmärchen, or literally art fairy tale. Now the Kunstmärchen was generally an original composition written by an author which used folkloric themes and motifs. However, the Kunstmärchen was often more realistic in its narrative, allowing the magic or wonder of the fairy tale to interact with or stand in an ambiguous relation to the real world. I've already mentioned Undine, that was George MacDonald's favourite. Another famous early example of the Kunstmärchen is The Golden Pot by E.T.A. Hoffmann, which represents a struggle for the soul of Anselmus, who's a feckless young student in Dresden. This struggle is between the lovely Serpentina, who often takes the form of a snake, and is the daughter of archivist Lindhorst, who, wait for it, is really a salamander. Indeed, the fairy tale on one level, and one of the great things about the Golden Pot, and one of the great things about teaching the Golden Pot actually, is that it works on so many levels. On one level, the fairy tale is actually the myth of the salamander story into which Anselmus gets sucked. On the other hand, Anselmus is attracted to and manipulated by the daughter of the assistant headmaster Palman, that is Veronica, whose chief ambition in life is to be admired for her social status and her dresses. Hoffmann's heroes are thus often torn between the fascinating but dangerous realm of magic and the safer consolations of petty bourgeois existence. And in one bound, we're into Privet Drive, Little Whinging, where Petunia Dursley tries desperately to deny her wizarding heritage. The tradition of fancy writing epitomised by the Harry Potter series has its roots in the German Kunstmärchen, or literary fairy tale, including works by Hans Christian Andersen, Josh MacDonald, Lewis Carroll, Kenneth Grahame, E. Nesbitt and many, many others. But by the time that tradition has got as far as, or if you're Jack Zite, had sunk as low as the Harry Potter series, we need to be considering why we don't need fairy tales, my third section. Now, Jack Zite has mounted a series of blistering attacks on consumer-driven Hollywood fairy tale films in general, and the Harry Potter franchise in particular. This is to continue a long battle against what he calls Disneyfication. Ironically, most of us will have first come across fairy tales in the Disney versions. So I think that's worth thinking about. But generations of feminist critics have been lambasting the cloning of passive blondes, not always literally blonde, waiting for their fairy godmother and or prince to come and rescue them. Now here are some blondes, not always literal, fairy tale princesses who are very passive, very nice, just waiting patiently for the right man to come along. There's another one, Cinderella in 1950. Again, Cinderella busy at her work. Now, Hollywood, like capitalism itself, is not done. Its armies of writers, producers and directors, doubtless controlled by men in smoke-filled rooms, has played the political correctness game very effectively. Except that, as Zipes says, its reconstructed heroines, if I can still use that word, are made over to be interchangeable with swashbuckling males. So if you go from this as a Cinderella Disney of 1950 to Snow White of Snow White and the Huntsman in 2012, this is not some blonde really, some self-effacing, passive little woman waiting to be rescued. The presentation of Snow White is quite different in this particular film. Now, one of the trickier moments in my own life was having to tell Jack Zipes, after he emailed me his latest tirade against the evils of Hollywood fairy tale films, that actually I was in the production team of Snow White and the Huntsman. I tried the lamest of all excuses, which never actually works, but it was too interesting to miss. But having criticised the gender stereotypes in fairy tales, it's worth pointing out that in some of the Italian and French fairy tales, which predate the Grimms, the female characters are not so passive, and most of the French fairy tales written by women were actively feminist in as much as they could be in the 17th and 18th century France. They were written by women whose only sphere of influence was a literary salon, where they could preside and perform their newly created fairy tales, which were often precisely about how a clever woman could subvert the patriarchal system. So the stereotype of the passive female is in some ways propagated by the Grimms, and then in Victorian tales, and then in Disney. We shouldn't assume that it was always and necessarily there, which leads us to consider why we do need fairy tales. As we've just seen, fairy tales can be a way of subverting and resisting forms of oppression. This was also the main purpose of fables, which were often found in collections of fairy tales. Fables were a means of criticising authority without seeming to do so. As Robert Louis, sorry about this little plug, as Robert Louis Stevenson refers in the unpublished draft in the Binacle Library in Yale University, the unpublished draft of his essay on fables, quote, "The fable of old, whose element of whimsical fantasy was partly a way of getting satire past forms of censorship." As he says, a satire in a fox skin could find an imprimatur. If you disguise your social criticism in the character of a fox, you can get it printed. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to get old Aesop off the hook. He was thrown off a cliff. So fairy tales have their uses, and didactic and moralistic fairy tales dominated stories written for the young people of the 19th century. Later writers of fairy tales, such as C.S. Lewis, were clearly using fairy tales for didactic purposes, even if Lewis quibbles about the appropriateness of the term allegory for his writing. Lewis's great critic, Philip Pullman, is of course equally didactic. He equally is ramming a message down your throat, if you hadn't noticed. The opposite message to Lewis, of course, but there you go. It's also been argued that fairy tales can help children deal with psychological issues. The Freudian influenced Bruno Bettelheim has given a famous, if problematic, account of the therapeutic usefulness of fairy tales. The title of his book, The Uses of Enchantment, which many people have come across, is even more explicit in German. Oh, I've got the wrong woman. Sorry, I had a picture. Anyway. Of the title and the German version of the text, which is Kinder brauchen Märchen, literally, children need fairy tales, which says it more effectively than the uses of enchantment, which actually I think was the original title because the book was originally written in English and then translated into German. So children need fairy tales, and it may be appropriate here to discuss now the question of the excessive violence in some fairy tales, which some people think is a reason why we don't need fairy tales. Admittedly, it may seem inappropriate to tell children about someone having their head or their hands cut off or being put in a barrel with nails on the inside, or in the one I was reading last night. I read fairy tales every night before I go to sleep. A classic move is, people are so stupid. The villains are sort of, it's like one of these, I don't digress, the end of an Agatha Christie movie. The denouement, and the villain is there. Everyone knows that the villain, except the villain, doesn't know that he or she's been sussed. So then the sort of main character says to the villain, now, if someone were to do blah, 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 how would you punish that person? Say, I would have them torn apart live by 12 horses. Funny you should say that. So, there's a lot of violence in fairy tales. Some people don't like it, but on the other hand, is it realistic to pretend that our so-called civilization is not built historically on appalling levels of cruelty to human beings, not to mention animals? The level, Nietzsche said it, but lots of people have said it, the level of cruelty. I'm rambling now, just think of slavery. I'm from Glasgow. The city of Glasgow is built on the proceeds of slavery. There's no getting away from that. Now that appalling violence and cruelty can't simply be disregarded. So if it comes into folk tales, I think it's appropriate that it should. Children should not be led to believe that the world is not a violent place. It is. The political usefulness of fairy tales has also been stressed, and not only in the sense of keeping the masses tranquilized with escapist fantasy, something the Disney products have been much criticised for, most relentlessly by Jack Zipes. Zipes is a Marxist, and one of his recent books, this is Grim Legacies actually, of this year, 2015, he devotes a chapter to the Marxist thinker Ernst Bloch, author of one of the great books of the 20th century, The Principle of Hope. Now Bloch was a committed utopian thinker, and it is the utopian function of fairy tales that is important to Zipes. Real fairy tales, and not the Disney versions where they're saccharine happily ever after endings, offer hope to the downtrodden masses that, with a bit of luck, a bit of cunning, and perhaps some supernatural help, maybe a magical fox or a horse, if not a fairy godmother, they may be a light at the end of the tunnel. We may make it, we may get through. It may not be quite as bad as it seems. It's this utopian function of fairy tales for the downtrodden masses that makes Zipes insist that fairy tales are originally oral and belong to the people and not to the literate, middle and upper class elite, as Brottinghauer argues. I've already mentioned that the proto-feminist use of fairy tales in the 17th and 18th century France, the writing of fairy tales of that kind of took off, but they exploded at the end of the 20th century. One of the major influences was Angela Carter's classic rewriting of fairy tales in her book, which everyone's presumably read, The Bloody Chamber, of 1979, which was preceded by her translation of the Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault in 1977. An important collection of feminist fairy tale writing was Don't Bet on the Prince. I finally caught up with the PowerPoints. Don't Bet on the Prince, Contemporary Feminist Fairy Tales in North America and England, edited by Jack Zipes, and containing such classics as Snow White by the Merseyside Fairy Story Collective. Let's have a laugh. We had a great time. That was a set text, a course I taught in the 1990s in the late lamented related arts course. Rod is here, he's nodding. Yeah, we had a great course back then that was one of the key texts. If fairy tales have long been used to address gender issues, the deployment of fairy tales in the interest of racial equality has been slower to arrive. Earlier this year, there was a piece in the online journal Mashable by Johanna Dester entitled 8 Diverse Fairy Tales Worthy of Hollywood Adaptations. The article raised a question of why, in the recent glut of Hollywood fairy tale films, there is so little ethnic diversity. So Ms. Dester asked some leading fairy tale scholars, Jack Zipes, Maria Titar and myself, to suggest some ethnically diverse fairy tales worthy of Hollywood adaptations, with the idea of combating the bias towards white, Eurocentric fairy tales. And we came up with 8 suggestions for Hollywood. Hollywood has not so far been in touch, but we're still waiting. There's also the problem of pick and mix approach to fairy tales as exotic commodities that was characteristic of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when there was a vogue for collecting a great variety of fairy tales from all over the world, actually all over our world, that is, in those days, the British Empire. This is obvious in Andrew Lang's famous collection of the multicoloured fairy books, starting with the blue fairy book and right through to, I think, the violet one at the end. So wherever the ambiguities of the fairy tale collections, such as Lang's, in her 2 Virago books of fairy tales, Angela Carter plundered the resources for quite different ends. Carter was in the business of subverting the racial and gender stereotypes which characterised the British Empire. Her fairy books celebrate cultural diversity and the resourcefulness of women. And I'll be using her book in my module starting after Christmas called Fairy Tales, Early Modern to Postmodern. Section 5, why fairy tales need us? Now, this is a perhaps odd way of looking at fairy tales, because it places the emphasis on fairy tales as having a life of their own that is dependent, perhaps parasitic, on human beings as storytellers and audience. Now, taking a cue... sorry, this is... I've got the wrong PowerPoint. I did have a picture of a book with all the technical terms on it, which I did only yesterday. Okay. Taking a cue from Richard Dawkins' famous book, The Selfish Gene, which was published in 1976, Jack Zipes has taken up some of the work done on so-called memes, that's M-E-M-E-S, that is units of meaning that replicate themselves using human consciousness and culture as a kind of host. What this does is to imitate the view that just as human beings and evolution is dominated by these genes which simply replicate themselves in bodies, so memes are kind of units of meaning which replicate themselves in human consciousness. Zipes takes up this idea in his book Why Fairy Tales Stick, the evolution and relevance of a genre, and in his later The Irresistible Fairy Tale. As Zipes himself says, the term meme and the related term memetics became so fashionable as to become almost meaningless. Personally, I'm not particularly enthusiastic about this kind of quasi-scientific approach to culture in general and fairy tales in particular, nor am I confess, a big fan of Richard Dawkins. However, there's a parallel approach which gives priority to the story in a similar kind of way. This is also introduced by Zipes in The Irresistible Fairy Tale, in which he introduces a book by Arthur Frank, which was on my PowerPoint, unfortunately, but it's not there now. This book is called Letting Stories Breathe, and the author says it proposes ways to think about and study stories so that we can learn to live better with the stories that surround and circulate through our lives. Frank claims that the stories may not actually breathe, but they can animate. The breath imputed by this book's title is the breath of a God in creation stories, as that God gives life to the lump that will become human. Stories animate human life. So that is their work. Stories work with people, for people, and always work on people, affecting what people are able to see as real as possible. Stories breathe life not only into individuals but also into groups that assemble around telling and believing fairy stories, or certain stories. I personally am very drawn to this approach to stories in general and to fairy tales in particular. And especially drawn because it links back to the German tradition in which I worked for 30 years. And now this may not interest more than a minority of people in the room. That minority is probably me, because I wrote my PhD thesis 30 odd years ago on a German philosopher called Hans-Georg Gadamer, who spoke about hermeneutics, which was precisely about this, about the way that tradition or language lives through people and groups speaking. It's not so much as Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, on whom this approach is very much based, as he famously said, die Sprache spricht, that is, language speaks. It's not so much we that speak language as language that speaks us, which takes us back to Frank's idea that fairy tales tell us at least as much as we tell fairy tales. And this leads into my final section, which is fairy tales and myth. If the fairy tale is difficult to define, myth is even harder. And I suspect that the OHP that I carefully designed to show you what the definition of myth in the OED is, it's bit in the dust at some point. The OED defines myth as a traditional story involving supernatural beings which provides an explanation for something such as the early history of society, a religious belief or ritual, or a natural phenomenon. Myth is strictly distinguished from allegory and legend by some scholars, but in general use it is often used interchangeably with these terms. Now, that last bit is important. Scholars have divided folk narratives into three subtypes: myth, legend and folktale, with fairy tales being a subcategory of the latter. But in general use, myth tends to overlap with legend and fairy tale, and especially in literary fairy tales, the narrative can seem to be distinctly mythic. In dealing with grand themes and issues such as the meaning of life, death, and everything. Now, again, am I missing PowerPoint? I'm really sorry about this. The German critic Walter Benjamin, for whom, quote, the fairy tale tells us of the earliest arrangements that mankind made to shake off the nightmare which myth has placed upon its chest. So for Benjamin, storytelling or stories allow us to escape from myth. So myth is constructed as to with power and control. Jack Zipes, following that, is critical of myth, and in his 1994 book, Fairy Tale as Myth, / Myth as Fairy Tale, he interprets it in terms of Roland Barthes' use of myth in his book Mythologies. In Barthes' book, which anyone who's a student here will have come across if they're any degrees in literary theory, Barthes famously uses the word myth as synonymous with ideology. Myth is Barthes' term for historically produced cultural effects which appear as natural, just given, and in some sense therefore eternal. In the present case, fairy tales with brave handsome princes rescuing lovely but passive damsels in distress and living happily ever after in conjugal bliss. Not that Barthes included fairy tale in his book alongside washing powders, wrestling matches and Citroen cars. What I've sketched is a fairy tale turned into a Barthian myth by Walt Disney. Now, I have no problem with exposing ideology, especially in Disney. I just don't particularly like using the word myth to do it. It seems to me there's another more important use of the word myth, which refers to a spiritual or mystical dimension in some myths and fairy tales. Other thinkers who want to insist on the power of fairy tales to function as myths include Marina Warner, who wrote in her recent book, Once Upon a Time, A Short History of the Fairy Tale, quote, fairy tales are gradually turning into myths, stories held in common about the deepest dilemmas, no longer aiming at being optimistic or consoling, but rather bearers of wisdom, deep, thought-provoking and illuminating. An example of a Kunstmärchen, or a literary fairy tale, straining to become myth is George MacDonald's The Golden Key, which if you're not read, you should read it, which addresses the deepest metaphysical questions of the origins of the cosmos and the fate of the soul after death. The two protagonists, who start off as a boy and a girl called Mossy and Tangle, embark on a quest for the door into which the golden key fits. This quest turns out to be for, quote, the land from which the shadows fall, a clear reference to Plato's idea of our world as a shadowy representation of a higher ideal realm. As the professor in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle says about, quote, the real Narnia, it's all in Plato. It's all in Plato. What do they teach them in schools these days? Well, this professor agreed, actually, and gave his first lecture at this university 30 odd years ago on the myths of Plato. Many of the greatest philosophers, such as Gadamer, see the history of Western thought as a long dialogue, a long conversation with Plato. But I want to end not with philosophy, but with a fairy tale. And one by the writer who wrote the best essay about fairy tales, that was Tolkien in his On Fairy Stories. When a new American edition of MacDonald's The Golden Key was due to appear in the 1960s, Tolkien was invited to write the introduction. Tolkien had written positive things about On Fairy Stories. Tolkien had written positive things in On Fairy Stories about MacDonald's fairy tales. So he seems the obvious choice. C.S. Lewis had recently died, so they asked Tolkien to do it. However, when Tolkien reread The Golden Key, he found that he had changed his mind and found himself unable to complete the introduction to The Golden Key. In fact, W.H. Auden came to the rescue. Instead, Tolkien started to write. This is instead of a critical introduction to The Golden Key. Tolkien started to write instead his own fairy tale, which is what he thought MacDonald should have written. This turned into his story called Smith of Wootton Major. And this is not the most prepossessing of titles, but that is precisely Tolkien's point, because this story is about how the very ordinary smith is especially chosen to visit fairyland. Now, I'll not say any more about this story. If you've not read it, I'll just leave it for you. I wouldn't dream of giving any spoilers to this particular story, because I think it's really great. All I'll say is that quite unexpectedly, sitting in my back garden some years ago, it actually reduced me to tears. This doesn't often happen to me, but this is exactly what a fairy tale should do, according to Tolkien's. Again, it's gone. Sorry. This is exactly what a fairy tale should do, according to Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, where he writes about the effect of fairy stories as physical. I'm quoting now. It is a mark of a good fairy story that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures it can give to child or adult that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and a lifting of the heart, near to and indeed accompanied by tears. Even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. In such stories, when a sudden turn comes, that is, when you suddenly realise that it's not going to end in disaster, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story unless a gleam comes through. So far from being flimsy and marginal, Tolkien believed that the fairy tale stands beside tragedy as one of the basic literary genre. This is also a deeply theological understanding of the fairy tale, because as Tolkien later asserted in the same essay, and this was a bold claim for a lay Roman Catholic in 1939, he said, "The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories." As the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich once said about the idea of symbol, one should never say only a symbol, but rather not less than a symbol. So I say, one should never say only a fairy tale, one should say rather not less than a fairy tale. Thank you very much.
Bill, thank you very much. At one point, Bill, when you were talking, you spoke about an author who described fairy tales as thoughtful and illuminating, and certainly that was what you were doing for us tonight, giving a really thoughtful, amusing and illuminating talk. So thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Just give Bill a moment to recover, and David has got a microphone in his hand. And are there any questions anybody would like to pose Bill? I'm sure not just about what he said, but anything that he didn't talk about that you mentioned.
I can ask a question. question. I don't really need the microphone.
Be gentle with me, Fiona.
I was just wondering if you were talking about Lewis. I was thinking about the ending of the last battle, and it just would be very, very interesting to me to hear your kind of reading of the last battle. You know, when they go kind of further in. I don't think this is on.
It is. You're okay, Fiona. Yeah.
Do you hear me?
We could hear you with the microphone. It might help everybody else as well. But that's fine. I think probably everybody caught it.
Sorry, we'll talk about the last battle and that sort of final, the climax of the Narnia series. What was your particular question, Fiona?
Well, just what reading would you give us of that? You know, I've always been quite intrigued by. I think it's a beautiful final image. You know, of them. I don't know. I suppose going further in, the world's meeting. Yeah.
Well, you put me on the spot.
Sorry.
I actually I go with that because it derives. C.S. Lewis was a very learned man, although he's often derided in rather superficial ways, I think. Can you still hear me, by the way?
Yes.
He's actually coming in a tradition of what is the Platonic tradition, which is what is being stated here at the end explicitly. That Platonic tradition takes many different forms, and sometimes people act as if Karl Popper had sort of finished Plato. I mean, wiped him off the planet. I mean, he's just an old totality. Well, maybe, but also there's much more to Platonism than what went on in ancient Greece. And I think Plato's thought took many centuries to unfold in various forms of Neoplatonism, which actually Neoplatonism forms the bedrock of all of Western mysticism, particularly the thing of Plotinus, right up to the present century. And actually, most forms of heresy in the Christian Church have been forms of Neoplatonism. Most of the best Neoplatonic thinkers have been burnt. So the fact that Lewis is actually ultimately coming from there, although it sits oddly with his projection of himself as bluff and orthodox, it's more complicated than that. I also can't resist saying at this point, I think that he gets a very hard time over what some has called the problem of Susan. Of course, Neil Gaiman has written a brilliant thing about the problem of Susan. People like Philip Pullman, at the drop of a hat, will have a go at C.S. Lewis for condemning Susan to eternity of hell. How could he do that? Well, he didn't do that, actually. He just didn't say that she went to heaven, because she didn't go. I mean, she was not with that party at that time that went. It says nothing about what other opportunities may have been available to Susan. I think to make out that Lewis kind of dumps Susan in hell for being interested in nihilism lipstick is a very crude and oversimple reading of the text, in my view.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, Bill, for that absolutely wonderful presentation. And you mentioned the violence in fairy tales. When my grandson was 5 years old, I thought I'd grab my copy of Grimm's, and I chose a fairy tale at random. Big mistake. I was only in the second page when the robbers, I think, were being crucified on some bleak hill outside the village, that he said, "Grandad, don't think this is really for children." But the question I wanted to ask you, and something you didn't mention, you did mention Bruno Bettelheim's uses of enchantment, or Kinderbrauchen Märchen, which I didn't know that title, by the way. That was very enlightening. But you didn't mention Marie-Louise von France and her sort of archetypal Jungian interpretations of fairy tales, which I find incredibly interesting. And I suppose as a musician, I love the narratives of fairy tales, because the characters kind of move like cardboard cutouts in some ways. Grimm especially, I think, and Erben's Czech fairy tales do the same. You've got these kind of very the characters that don't seem to develop very much. And the question really is whether you link the memes, this interpretation, with the archetypes, as I would with the speed of the narratives and the way in which the motifs of fairy tales emerge almost like musical narratives rather than purely literary ones.
Thank you, Rod. That is very enlightening. Very interesting. Actually, I had a paragraph on Jung which I took out simply because of the constraints of time. But it was there, I promised you, especially Maria Louise von Franz. It was there. I must. Bloch said of Ernst Bloch said of Jung that he was a fascist. But then people said of Heidegger as fascist. I mean, I think those questions, those kind of comments are easy to make, but it doesn't necessarily destroy the significance of the work. In terms of Jung, I very much, on my to-do list, I want to get, actually Richard used to get on me like this. He gave me a whole reading list, which my latest student has updated me on, of postmodern Jung. Not the old Jung, who is actually like some crude version of Platonism with these kind of static archetypes, which just don't work nowadays. But there are different ways of doing Jung, which I think are very exciting, and just touching on that. And the connection with music also, I find fascinating. And I'm involved in several projects to do with fairy tales and music, which we can talk about at some length over a drink.
Do you actually see those the memes and the archetypes as some interchangeable, or is that me sort of concocting that and making it fit my own sort of image?
I have the idea that there's some entities which are kind of supra individual, which are in control of what's going on in people's lives via story. I mean, memes does that job, but I'm not particularly drawn to it. I have to say I'm much happier with that other German tradition, which, I think this disappeared with the photocopy, or with the power plant, somewhere between my study and this lecture hall. It's not so much we that tell stories, that stories tell us. And that idea of, I think you can do that with a certain German tradition, which very much works in that kind of way. And bring in memes if you like, but I'm happier with Gadamer, a touch with postmodern Jung. That does it for me.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Hi. Bill, you argued very eloquently and I would say quite elegiacally for the continued importance of fairy tale in our contemporary world. And you also mentioned that Jack Zipes' 2012 book, The Irresistible Rise of Fairy Tale, was his magnum opus. But those aren't the books that most literary critics have read. You know, most people will say that his force was at its greatest in the 80s with radical fairy tales and books from that time. So at a time when, and in the 80s, Zipes he was entertaining. He was a shouty Marxist in a world of Western yuppies.
I hope this is being recorded, Jack. Do you hear that?
Bettelheim was, kind of on the coattails of psychoanalysis,
yeah.
And so for the 80s and 90s, fairy tale studies becomes exciting. It has these big radical characters bankrolled by liberal arts education, and in the 90s, of course, you have feminist scholars sort of rounding off the fairy tale studies project with Marina Warner or Diane Purkis, Angela Carter that you mentioned. And so I suppose my question is, given that Disney is now responsible for its own undisneyfication in movies like Maleficent, which is actually quite good, and given that, I'm really sorry, but Snow White and the Huntsman was terrible, and there's lots. So given that that the contemporary fairy tale is lots of terrible movies, the Harry Potterverse, which is saturated with scholars, and possibly Terry Pratchett as well. Where do you see the future of fairy tale studies going, and how does it get to be? How is it going to manoeuvre itself to become relevant again?
Well, you've asked quite a few questions there. First thing I'd like to say is, Jack Zipes was really a very potent force in the in the 1980s. Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion, that's in a way the big book. So having said that, Jack Zipes is a potent force now. The thing about Jack Zipes is that he doesn't obey other people's rules. And one of the interesting things is, if you look at the prefaces to his books, they're filled with references to other scholars. It's as if, and he says in one of them actually, that I actually had given up. I thought, to the end of my career. And then I'm starting to meet some people, and actually I feel very flattered that I'm one of these people named in the preface. That it was not dead. This movement of fairy tale exploration was still very much alive and very much kicking. And I would mention some others in that circle. Christina Bachilega is a really powerful force now in that area, doing some of the stuff that Jack did, but in her own way, very powerfully. There's a big new edition of Don Haz's Greenwood Encyclopedia of Folk Tales and Fairy Tales coming out this December. Anyone Who's Anyone is in that book. So it's very much still alive, I think. And Jack's in there, kicking with the rest of them in a very amazing way, I think. He is not someone who knows the words, that's enough, Jack. In fact, I probably shouldn't say this, but I was talking in the last year or so to a very eminent scholar in this area, and I said something, I would say that, but I'm very aware of Jack sort of sitting on my shoulder. He said, "It's that way for you too, is it?" So he's a big, big figure. You don't have to agree with everything he says. I don't, but you cannot deny the power of his influence in the field.
Are you suggesting that he has a wider readership than people just interested in folklore and fairy tale studies?
Well, that could be checked in various ways, I don't know. But I mean, he reaches outside the small world of literary studies in a really impressive way, I think. He also supports Arsenal, which for me is very much in his favour.
I thought you were going to say it's also part of a fairy tale, but now I don't want to go in that dangerous, dangerous territory.
The match on Saturday was unbelievable.
Any other questions? Yeah, down here, thank you.
I was just thinking about the ties between fairy tales and Hollywood. And Hollywood at the moment particularly is being very much criticised for recycling and remaking films. But I was thinking about, well, that's what happens in fairy tales. They've been retold and retold and retold. And I was wondering what you think the reason is that financial kind of considerations aside, why we feel compelled to retell stories instead of writing new ones. Why there's this sort of urge to recycle, if you will.
Well, in a way, I think we're back to what Rod raised. In a sense, I think in a good sense, we are not in control of fairy tales. They are bringing to us perspectives, ways of feeling about the world, which are not built into our culture. So by going back, we're in some ways recuperating different perspectives, or are being gifted different perspectives. And I agree with you absolutely. that everyone who kind of slags off Disney, yeah, of course, and then the latest remakes and so on, yeah. But all they're doing actually is what storytellers have always done. They're recycling it. That's how else do you do it? Or we're being recycled through these narratives, and I find that quite a hopeful perspective, if it makes sense.
The book has 7 basic tales.
Did that answer your question? A bit.
I was just wondering
A bit.
Okay, we've got one question here, and then at the back, and then down at the front, and then I think we'll probably have to wrap it up there. But on you.
I was just wondering, because I can see a visible need for fairy tales such as Goldilocks and the Three Bears, in that fairy tales like those promote a sense of morals in children, such as don't steal, don't listen to strangers, etc. But the problem is, I'm not entirely too sure if I can see any need for fairy tales such as Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella. I mean, to me, they've always promoted a sense of a complete fallacy of a love at first sight. I was just wondering, would there be, in the future, any need for such fairy tales as those?
Well, with respect, I would see everything exactly the opposite way around. I think if you're going to give children lessons about not doing things, you give them lessons about not doing things. What's going on in Sleeping Beauty, it seems to me, is something more powerful than that. The difficulty is that what's going on is not always tied down to concepts. George MacDonald knew this. He said very clearly, whatever a fairy tale is doing, it's not giving you concepts, it's giving you feelings. And he would not, people press him and say, what does this fairy tale mean? He says, well, it means what it means for you, and what it means for you is how you feel about it. And he explicitly said, a fairy tale is like a sonata. You get people responding to it, but you can't get kind of conceptual agreement about what's going on in a sonata. You can respond to the feelings produced in the music, which suggest dimensions of experience which may be excluded in other parts of our life, which is, I think, why they live on. They're touching places other certain Hollywood movies don't touch, but they have a power to attract, to convince, to persuade, to suggest, which is almost unique in human history, I think.
Thanks, Bill. Right at the back, and then down at the front. He was getting a good bit of exercise there.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, be gentle with me.
I will. You made a comment when you were talking about the brothers Grimm, that it was written while the Grimm brothers were living in occupied Germany.
Yeah.
And my thoughts went to the school of thought about the Gothic and about how the Gothic emerges at times of cultural uncertainty, fear of threat of the internal other and things like that. And I wondered if you saw a similar correlation with the peaks and troughs of seeing, like at the moment we have a plethora of fairy tale Hollywood movies. Is there a similar correlation with fairy tales, or is that too restrictive?
Yeah, I think you're onto something important there. I mean, the Gothic emerges around about the same time the Romantic movement is emerging, at the same time as this new interest in folklore, folk culture, fairy tales. It's all happening about the same time, and it's certainly very tied up with the cultural confusion, if you like, of Europe at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. The particular take that the Grimms had was to make it to do with national identity, which is again very much part of that same mix. But also it certainly links with the idea of the Gothic, because, as I say in another lecture somewhere, the Enlightenment idea of things being as clear as day was kind of rejected by the Romantics, who wanted everything to be as dark and interesting as possible. And it's the margins, what is unique, what is weird, that becomes interesting rather than what's just the same for everyone. Because what's just the same for everyone is what the Enlightenment is precisely about.
Okay, thank you. We're making you work tonight.
The Grimms, by the way, were correspondents with Sir Walter Scott. There was interesting correspondence between them.
This isn't really. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep.
Can hear you.
Not really a question, but a contemporary relevance of fairy tales, and this is my life. I'm an adoptive mum, and 20 years ago when I adopted a 7.5-year-old who had been through hell, one of the things that really, really helped me was in my induction, if you like, a social worker telling me about the story of the little shoemaker who puts the shoes out with his last bit of leather for the fairies, and the fairies provide him with a bowl of soup that will always be full. And she said to me, you've got to be that bowl of soup which always replenishes itself, so no matter what this kid does, you've got to fill the soup bowl up again. And that made a huge difference to me, this, about relevance of fairy tale. Now the other thing is that I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a shrink. And quite often it occurs to me when I'm listening to somebody that they might be waiting for Prince Charming, or they might be trying to create a Sleeping Beauty world in which there are no needles and pins. And so being able to refer to the fairy tales gets straight to what's happening in a very meaningful and strong way that other things may not reach.
I agree with you very much. I could take that in many ways. Anyone want to come in here? Anyone to respond to that? Just this idea that a fairy tale can elicit a response that you might not get in a different way. And I don't know what kind of therapist you are, I'm not go there. But I actually was thinking as you were speaking, the problem with Bettelheim is on one level is very slick, and they all sort of line up and you can see it all working, and which makes it almost seem like an intellectual game. Oh, this fairy tale is about this particular complex, and you can connect everything that way. And that works, but it's still quite intellectual. It seems to me that the way fairy tales work is not on an intellectual level. They get under the intellectual guard, and that's why they're so powerful, why they can be so dangerous, why they're so able to be manipulated. But that's why I think they are so powerful.
One final point from Rod.
Well, only because it links, I think, very strongly to something else that we haven't talked about, which is dreams, and the way in which the narratives of dreams so often take on a fairy tale-like atmosphere, and in a similar way can have profound therapeutic value for the dreamer if they're used and listened to in the correct way. The great Czech animator Jan Schwankmajer said, I was listening to him at the Cardiff Animation Festival some years ago, and he said, until we listen to our dreams and read our fairy tales, there isn't and tell each other our dreams and our fairy tales every night, and tell each other our dreams every morning, there's not very much hope for us.
That actually sounds like a perfect way to finish the questions on, Rod. Thank you ever so much. Thank you to all of you for your attention and wide-ranging questions, which I think actually just serves to illustrate the depth and the richness of fairy tales, the telling and the listening and the hearing. So Bill, thank you ever so much for that. It's brought a lot of thought, and thank you. It's been super.